Secretary Cheney and General Powell are here to...
The fear the American public might turn against the military, as they had over Vietnam, influenced Powell's thinking throughout the war. Public relations was the war's second front.
As a measure of effectiveness of how we're doing in the air campaign, I just pull these two things out. I've laundered them so you can't really tell what I'm talking about because I don't want the Iraqis to know what I'm talking about. But trust me, trust me.
Officially, Saddam was not a target. But the Allies launched 260 missions against sites where they thought he might be hiding. Eventually, spies reported Saddam slept in private houses, changing location every night.
You can find out perhaps where he has been. You can find out even where he is. But what you need to know is where he's going to be, because you must mount an attack. And so it's almost an impossible task.
You might find it strange, but the President of the Republic of Iraq was sometimes driven around the city in an old taxi. It's strange but true that Saddam also used a lorry to move around the city. These are some of the measures he resorted to.
The Air Force kept searching. These pictures prompted some of the more improbable missions of the war. Saddam was inside an American motorhome known as a Winnebago.
When we saw him sitting in a Winnebago, we went after the Winnebagos with a vengeance, and whenever we saw one or tried to find one, and whenever we saw one or two or three, we would attack them as quickly as we possibly could.
Iraqi soldiers in Kuwait opened a pipeline flooding the Gulf with oil. The aim was to destroy the desalination plants that provided Saudi Arabia with drinking water. Saddam wanted to provoke an early land war and inflict casualties to undermine Western resolve. The desalination plants continued to work, and a bombing raid cut the flow of oil.
Saddam became tense and anxious, although he tried to conceal it. He was restless. It wasn't so much that he cared about the casualties, but they exasperated him.
The attacks on Baghdad continued. Stealth bombers by night, cruise missiles by day. The missiles used the hotel where foreign journalists stayed as a final position check before heading for their targets. Coalition prisoners were now held in Baghdad.
They just yanked me up and just karate chopped from kind of felt like the heel of the boot just into my knee, and I collapsed again, and they just pulled me up, smack, pulled me up, smack, pull me up, smack, pull me up, smack, and eventually, and somewhere in there whilst they're doing that, they say, "Are you pilot or navigator? Are you pilot?" And eventually, pilot, and it just came out. I couldn't stop it, and that's when you realise you've broken to the violence. You feel a desperate sense of failure that you've let everyone down.
Do you have a message?
I thought everyone thought I was a traitor, and that everyone would see that I'd failed, and that was the last image my family was going to see of me.
Terry and Guy, I love you.
Somebody came up and he said, "We're going to execute you, or you can go on TV." And it was a stark choice of, make the broadcast or be killed.
I think this war should be stopped so we can go home. I do not agree on this war with Iraq.
And that was, I think, the ultimate shame. Everything that had gone before paled in insignificance. about sitting in front of a TV camera and decrying your country, for want of a better expression.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right there. Look at here. Right through the crosshairs.
Coalition superiority was overwhelming, but the airmen were running out of targets.
And now in his rearview mirror,
we've got to look at the target list a little more closely. And we got to take a look at what it is we're doing in Baghdad itself. We didn't shut down all targets in Baghdad, but I asked questions like, why are we bombing the Ba'ath Party headquarters for the 8th time? Do we think there is somebody still in the Ba'ath Party headquarters? Why are we bouncing rubble with million-dollar missiles?
The bombing campaign had crippled Iraq, but Saddam was still in power and his troops still in Kuwait. It was clear that air power alone could not win the war.
How much more hitting of strategic targets in Baghdad would have caused Saddam Hussein to move his forces out of the desert? Let's get real. Ultimately, if you want to gain Kuwait back, and if you want to do what the United Nations charged us to do, you've got to go on the ground and take it back. Saddam Hussein was not going to vacate the trenches and the area where he was without someone going in on the ground, kicking him out.
On the ground, 500,000 American, British, French, and Arab troops moved to their final positions. The ground attack to liberate Kuwait would begin in 11 days. Now all eyes were on Norman Schwarzkopf. In the days before the ground attack, he was haunted by the fear of massive casualties. Schwarzkopf was under pressure. His explosions of temper were common knowledge.
Working with Norm Schwarzkopf was sort of like watching a thermometer. The blood would start around the shirt collar, and then it would work its way up to the jawline and then to the ears. And by the time it got to the ears, you ought to watch out.
I would say that working for General Schwarzkopf was a privilege and an honor, but there were many times when if someone had asked me if I would rather have been in that war room or in a dental chair having a root canal without anesthesia, I probably would have chosen the dental chair.
Schwarzkopf's staff feared him. The British watched in amazement.
Norman going ballistic put people off their jobs and took their eye off the ball. But on the upside, he was a brilliant military strategist with a lot of experience. He understood the Arabs and the Arab world, and he was a great diplomat and was able to bring nations along and foreign armies along in a way that a lesser man would not have been able to.
When human lives are on the line, you cannot be cavalier. You can't do enough. You cannot do enough. You must do everything you possibly can and leave no stone unturned, and you can't settle. You can never settle for second best or a second-class solution when you're dealing with enterprises of such magnitude that they involve the lives of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Colin Powell and the American Defense Secretary, Dick Cheney, flew in to check the plans. Schwarzkopf said he'd attack in 2 weeks, not before.
Dick liked Norm, respected Norm, had confidence in Norm, but every now and then Dick reflected on the fact that this was a very important operation. It was for all the marbles, as we say. And Norm was known to be volatile. Norm was known to be also reluctant. I sort of get the tag for being the reluctant warrior, but you won't find many of my military colleagues who were anxious to race into this before we were ready to race into it.
Despite the bombing of Iraq, Saddam Hussein still had 400,000 troops around Kuwait, behind a barrier of minefields, trenches, and barbed wire. He believed he and his generals could force a bloody stalemate if Allied troops attacked these defenses, and that the lesson of Vietnam was America would not tolerate heavy casualties.
Saddam thought the American troops were not prepared for the experience of battle, and that Vietnam had traumatized the American administration.
Colin Powell and Dick Cheney returned from their visit to Schwarzkopf. They told an impatient George Bush the Allied troops could attack in 2 weeks. Bush was anxious the date didn't slip. Moscow's support, crucial to the coalition, was weakening. Earlier that day, the Soviets had suggested postponing the attack to allow negotiations.
Any action that is taken, we are not going to suit somebody else's timetable, whether he lives in Baghdad or any place else.
When the War Cabinet met to inspect the plan of attack, the President's impatience was tempered with a stark warning. The fighting on the ground would be bloodier than he expected.
I was quite confident we would be successful because we had put together a decisive force. But no plan survives first contact with a real enemy.
Colin made a very eloquent statement warning everybody it was going to be a lot uglier and a lot messier than they thought. The battle would not go as the plans said, and that he had an obligation to warn the president about casualties, that there were unpredictable circumstances in war, and that once it started, the president was no longer in control.
But the president's impatience was justified.
Was targeted by rocket, by missile or by bomb?
By rockets.
On Gorbachev's orders, a high-ranking Soviet diplomat traveled to Baghdad. Yevgeny Primakov's mission was to urge Saddam Hussein to accept a face-saving deal. After inspecting the damage, Primakov was taken to a government guest house in central Baghdad.
He came in wearing a long trench coat. It was cold. There was an electric stove on. When we were left alone, I told him, "I'm not a military expert, but if a land offensive begins, your troops in Kuwait will be wiped out. You have a great burden of responsibility." Then he said for the first time quite directly, "Okay, I'm going to withdraw my troops from Kuwait. I just want to be sure that as I retreat, they don't shoot me in the back."
48 hours before the ground attack was due, Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz arrived in Moscow. Saddam's admission that he was willing to withdraw had led to frantic Soviet diplomacy to save their old ally from defeat.
Gorbachev, to me, was making one last attempt to try and have it both ways. He wanted to stay with the United States in the course of this conflict, and yet he also was under, I think, great pressure from various elements of the Soviet bureaucracy to try and preserve this client relationship with the Iraqis and with Saddam Hussein, who, after all, had been a Soviet client for many, many years.
Aziz went straight to the Kremlin. The Soviet president was waiting. Aziz told Gorbachev he wouldn't accept the UN resolutions that called for Iraq to recognize Kuwait's independence and pay compensation. But he said Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Gorbachev thought that was good enough. He telephoned Washington.
Gorbachev called the president saying, "Look, I've worked this out whereby we can get Saddam out of Kuwait without a war."
I told President Bush, "George, you shouldn't just be thinking about how to begin your attack. You should be thinking about how to avoid it. While the generals plan, we should think about how to end the war."